Have you ever loved something so deeply that it felt like a part of your own soul, only to watch someone else try to rip it away from you? That's exactly what happened to me with my homeowners association. The very group that was supposed to protect our neighborhood tried to claim ownership of my historic tree. What started as a ridiculous demand quickly grew into a nightmare, and eventually a courtroom drama that would cost them $500,000. But let me take you back to the beginning, because this story is more than just about a tree. It's about history, greed, and the fight to protect what's truly yours. I live in a small, quiet neighborhood that looks like any other suburban community. You probably drive by and never give a second thought. But in my front yard stood something different, something that gave my home and my heart a unique connection to history, a tree that was nearly 200 years old. It wasn't just any tree. It was a massive oak that had witnessed generations of families, storms, celebrations, and change. My grandparents told me stories about how people in town used to gather under its branches. Couples carved their initials in the bark decades ago. Kids, including myself, once climbed it to feel like kings ruling from a leafy throne. To me, this tree wasn't just a plant. It was a living monument. And because of its age and cultural value, the city even recognized it as a protected historic landmark. That meant it was legally documented, recorded, and part of the city's identity. In simple words, it was a treasure, and it was in my yard. But apparently, that didn't matter to my HOA. The trouble started one afternoon when I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It wasn't the usual friendly neighborhood reminder. No, this one was bold, official, and filled with threats. The HOA claimed that the historic tree in my yard was actually community property. They argued it fell under their management rights, even though every document I owned clearly showed it was on my land. They insisted they had the right to decide what to do with it, and their plan, believe it or not, was to cut it down. Yes, cut it down. Imagine standing in front of something that had lived through centuries, something that connected your family to your community's roots, and hearing that a group of people in suits wanted to destroy it because they thought it looked messy. That was their reason. They said it made the neighborhood less uniform. My blood boiled. At first, I laughed it off. Surely this had to be a mistake. But soon, I realized they weren't joking. The HOA started sending me weekly notices demanding compliance. They told me if I didn't allow them access to the tree, I would be fined. Can you imagine being fined for protecting your own property? I tried reasoning with them. I explained the tree's history. I showed them the city certificate that labeled it as historic, and I begged them to understand that this tree was not just mine. It belonged to the story of everyone who had ever lived here. But reason doesn't work with greed. They weren't listening. Instead, they doubled down. One morning, I woke up to find HOA board members standing near the tree, pointing at it, measuring, and writing notes. They hadn't even asked permission to come onto my property. When I confronted them, they said they were evaluating community assets. Community assets? That's when I knew this wasn't just about a tree. This was about control. You see, HOAs often get taste of power, and when they do, they sometimes forget they're dealing with real people in real lives. To them, my tree wasn't history. It wasn't a living being. It was an obstacle, and obstacles, in their eyes, needed to be removed. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure only grew. Letters in the mail, threats of legal action, fines stacking up. Every night, I went to bed wondering if the next day I'd hear the sound of chainsaws outside my window. I can't even explain the kind of stress that puts on a person. To some, it may sound silly, fighting over a tree, but to me, it felt like someone trying to erase a piece of my identity. The more I resisted, the more aggressive they became. One board member even told me, "You don't own that tree. The HOA does." Those words cut deeper than any axe ever could. But here's the thing, they were wrong. And I knew it. That's when I decided to fight back. I started collecting every single notice they had sent me. I took pictures of the tree in my yard, and even the trespassing moments when HOA members stepped onto my property. Without permission, I dug out the deed to my home, where the boundary lines clearly showed the tree belonged to me. I contacted the city office and got a copy of the official certificate recognizing the tree as a historic landmark. Piece by piece, I built a wall of proof. And then I did something that made the HOA tremble. I hired a lawyer. When the HOA learned I wasn't going to roll over and obey, they tried to intimidate me even more. They filed a claim saying I was withholding community resources. But when my lawyer and I responded with the evidence, everything changed. Their threats suddenly turned into stammering excuses. But they had already crossed a line. By trespassing, harassing, and trying to illegally claim my property, they weren't just being unreasonable, they were breaking the law. My lawyer explained that we had a strong case, and not only could we protect the tree, but we could also make the HOA pay for what they had done. And let me tell you, that was music to my ears. The case went to court, and that's when the real drama began. The HOA strutted into the courtroom like they owned the place. They thought their fancy titles and neighborhood rules would impress the judge. They claimed the tree was unsightly, that it caused community inconvenience, and that they had the right to remove it. But when the judge saw the documents, the deed, the photos, the historic certificate, their arrogance began to crumble. I'll never forget the moment the judge leaned forward and asked the HOA's lawyer, "On what legal basis are you claiming ownership of this tree?" There was silence, awkward, painful silence. Because the truth was, they had no legal basis. They just thought they could bully me into submission. And here's where the twist comes in. Not only did the judge rule in my favor, but he also fined the HOA for their reckless behavior. And not just a small fine. No. The court ordered them to pay $500,000 for harassment, trespassing, and trying to illegally claim my property. $500,000. All because they couldn't respect a tree. When I heard the ruling, I felt like the branches of that old oak stretched out to shield me in victory. I wasn't just protecting a tree. I was protecting history, my rights, and the principle that no one, not even an HOA, can take what doesn't belong to them. But this story doesn't end here. That fine shook the entire community. Some neighbors applauded me. Others were furious because their HOA fees skyrocketed to cover the cost. The board members resigned in disgrace, and the reputation of the HOA was forever stained. And through it all, the tree still stands. Strong, proud, and unbroken, just like me. So here's the lesson. When someone tries to take what you love, when they tell you that you don't have the right to protect what's yours, remember this story. Stand tall like that tree. Fight back, because sometimes the roots of justice run deeper than anyone realizes. Have you ever won a battle but felt like the real war was only beginning? That's exactly what happened after the judge slammed his gavel and ordered my HOA to pay $500,000. On paper, I had won. In reality, what followed was a storm that shook my entire neighborhood to its roots. Victory came with consequences, some sweet, some bitter, and some I never saw coming. When the court ruling became public, the news spread like wildfire. Local newspapers picked up the story. Headline screamed, "Homeowner defeats HOA over historic tree. Court awards $500,000 fine." Some called me a hero. Others painted me as a troublemaker who brought shame and debt to the community. For weeks, it felt like I was living under a microscope. At first, I was proud. I had stood up for my rights, and the law had backed me. My tree was safe, my dignity intact, and justice had been served. But it didn't take long for me to realize that $500,000 doesn't just fall out of thin air. The HOA didn't have that kind of money sitting around. And when an HOA gets fined, who do you think ends up paying the price? That's right, the homeowners. Almost overnight, HOA fees skyrocketed. People who were already struggling to make ends meet suddenly faced new bills. Families who had nothing to do with the board's reckless actions were now being punished for their arrogance. And guess who they blamed? Not the HOA, not the board members. They blamed me. Walking through the neighborhood became awkward. Some neighbors glared, whispering under their breath as I passed by. Others confronted me directly, saying things like, "Because of you, my fees doubled," or "Why couldn't you just compromise?" Compromise? As if I should let them cut down a 200-year-old historic tree just to avoid conflict. Those words stung, but I stood firm. Still, the tension in the community grew thicker by the day. The board members who had started this mess resigned in shame. But that didn't solve the problem. New members had to be elected, and the meetings turned into screaming matches. Neighbors accused one another of mishandling money, of choosing sides, of being anti-community. Friendships ended. Bonds broke. The HOA wasn't just fined, it was fractured. And yet, in the middle of all that chaos, the tree stood tall. Its branches stretched across the sky, as if mocking the pettiness of human greed. I often sat under at night, listening to the wind in the leaves, reminded myself why I fought so hard. But peace was still far away. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The HOA hadn't just lost in court. They had exposed their corruption. People started digging deeper. Documents leaked. It turned out this wasn't the first time they had overstepped. They had quietly fined homeowners for ridiculous reasons for years. Paint colors, flower choices, even kids' toys left on lawns. They had pocketed fees without transparency, and the tree scandal had pulled the curtain back on their entire operation. Soon, lawsuits began piling up. Other neighbors who had felt bullied by the HOA came forward with their own stories. The once powerful association was now drowning in legal trouble. Lawyers circled like vultures. What was once a symbol of control became a sinking ship, and everyone wanted off. Ironically, the same neighbors who once blamed me for higher fees started thanking me. They realized that if I hadn't fought back, the HOA would have continued their abusive ways unchecked. Some even called me the spark that lit a fire change. It felt good to hear that, but it also made me think, why did it take $500,000 for people to finally see the truth? The local government also stepped in. Since the tree was a historic landmark, city officials launched an investigation into how the HOA dared to claim ownership in the first place. It turned out they had misrepresented facts in their paperwork and lied about their rights. The city threatened to revoke their charter unless they cleaned up their act. The HOA's reputation was ruined beyond repair. But here's the strange part. Even after all that, some people still supported the old board. They said the HOA was just trying to maintain order and that I had overreacted. Can you believe that? It showed me something important. No matter how right you are, there will always be people who refuse to see the truth, and you can't waste your life trying to please them. The turning point came when a local historian reached out to me. He asked if he could feature my tree in a book about the town's heritage. He told me that the oak was one of the oldest living things in the county, and that its preservation was a victory not just for me, but for everyone who valued history. That moment made me realize this fight was never just personal. It was bigger than me. By standing up to the HOA, I hadn't just protected a tree. I had preserved a piece of living history for future generations. And that's when my perspective changed. Instead of seeing myself as someone who caused trouble, I began to see myself as a guardian of something priceless. And suddenly, the judgment, the gossip, the stares, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I had done the right thing, no matter the cost. The months that followed were messy. The HOA had to restructure, new leadership was voted in, and strict oversight was placed on their finances. It was far from perfect, but at least the culture of unchecked power was broken. Neighbors slowly began healing, though scars remained. Some people moved away, unable to deal with the higher fees. Others stayed but carried grudges. The community would never be the same again. As for me, I found peace in knowing I had fought the good fight. Every morning, when I step outside and see that towering oak, I feel a rush of pride. Its roots are deep, its branches wide, and its presence unshakable. It reminds me that sometimes standing your ground isn't easy. Sometimes it costs you relationships, comfort, and even safety. But in the end, truth is worth protecting. So what's the lesson here? It's simple. Never underestimate the power of one voice. Never believe you're too small to stand against something wrong. Whether it's an HOA, a company, or even a group of people trying to bully you, remember, you have rights. And if you fight with courage and persistence, you can win. Because here's the truth. Power only works when people are afraid to resist. The moment you stop being afraid, the moment you decide enough is enough, that's when change begins. My tree is proof of that. The $500,000 fine is proof of that. And my story is living proof of that. So next time someone tells you it's not worth the fight, Think of my oak tree. Think of how one person's refusal to give and change an entire neighborhood. And remember, you have more strength in you than you realize.